Let's welcome in our pal Murat. He's got one heck of a background today to join us. As I mentioned off the top of the show, two excellent must-reads for Winnipeg Jet fans in The Athletic right now, talking about Nikolaj Ehlers and the coaching position. Murat joins us now on WST. What's going on, my friend? Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you, Huss.
I think with Jet fans right now, player-wise, the most intriguing thing that we are certainly hearing rumors on, and I think common sense would tell you that it is a possibility, is that longtime Winnipeg Jet Nikolaj Ehlers, going into the final year of his contract before unrestricted free agency, is potentially a trade chip for the club. Before we get to everything in it, I mean, give us your thoughts on the situation that Ehlers is in, and really both sides' thoughts on it. I mean, Ehlers, a great player, a valuable asset for Winnipeg, but also a guy that in his mind, I think, might believe that, considering where he's sort of been in the pecking order here in Winnipeg, that there might be greener pastures out there.
Yeah, I mean, we could do the long view on him. Just consider where he would have been in his life when he signed that $6 million extension that comes to an end next year. It's got 10 team no trade clause. Like, this is the sort of thing you give to a player who's part of the foundation, who's like Kyle Connor after him, like Mark Scheifele. That contract ends, and now he's got his extension on the extension now, the big raise that he's going to get. These are the moves that Winnipeg made when it was a team absolutely loaded with quality young players that was building for a future just like the one that it has now. He was supposed to be a foundational cog. What he's experienced in the time since then is moments where he's been a first-line promoted player by merit, certainly some development where he was a second-line player by merit as well. But no matter what happens when he gets that promotion now, whether it's with Mark Scheifele on that first line where he's outscoring everybody dramatically, or whether it's first-line power play time, it never lasts. There is some reason, whether it's his own ability, whether it's three coaching staff's perception of him, whether it's the fit on the team with the teammates, where he's produced more per minute of ice time than any other Jets player over the duration of his contract. That includes Mark Scheifele, it includes Kyle Connor, it includes Blake Wheeler, and all the Jets gone by. No one has produced more points per minute of ice time than Nikolaj Ehlers has. So why is he playing less than Mason Appleton? I think at 28 years old, heading into the final year of this deal, it would make sense, even if he loves his teammates, even if he loves everything about Winnipeg, to at least consider what the future holds for him. And if he's doing that, which I think there's some sense in that, Winnipeg needs to start to consider, well, what's the long term for us? What assets can we get back? And I think that's something that they've started to consider. I think that's something they've started to plan for. And I think that once it has its coaching situation sorted out, that's going to be something we see them pursue.
You laid it out really, really well. He has been incredibly productive. He has not often been in that top line role. And I mean, he had 25 goals this year, 0 on the power play. I mean, it speaks to where he's, making his hay at 5-on-5. There are plenty of theories, and I don't know how many, over the history of WST, I don't know how many hours we've talked about Nikolaj Ehlers, the situation, where he's at, how he's playing, all that. I'm a little flummoxed by, are we talking about coaches that have thought the same way about a player? Or does this come down to other players in the room being more comfortable with other guys and that sort of making Nikolaj Ehlers the victim?
Anything that I would say on that part is speculation. It's just my interpretation. So let's be clear, because I do want to share what my opinions and what my interpretations are. I just don't want that to be taken as fact, right? I think it's a fact that Winnipeg's going to explore trading him. I don't think it's a fact that what I'm about to say interpretation-wise is true. And basically that is that there's two sides to it for me. One is that I think that some of the decision makers are going by emotion as opposed to results. And that applies to Paul Maurice, Dave Lowry, Rick Bowness, where you can look at all the minutes, you can look at all of the outscoring that he does, you can look at the Sterling goals for and goals against numbers. Like, the whole point of the game is to score more goals than the other team, right? And nobody's done that better alongside Mark Scheifele on the top line than Ehlers has. And that's a remarkable thing to say on a team with Kyle Connor on it, and which had Blake Wheeler on it, and so on and so forth. Ehlers has done remarkable work. But I think the emotional side comes into play because he can be a bit maddening to watch. He makes confusing decisions at the blue lines. He makes giveaways. There are moments where he makes decisions that players who aren't as good as him would make smarter, better ones with the puck, and you watch the puck go the other way, and then some chaos ensue. Certainly when he's playing jazz on his way into the offensive zone, I think that flat-foots some teammates too from time to time. And I've always wondered if there's just a preference amongst Jets centers, Scheifele being predominant among them, to play with Kyle Connor, to play with somebody who they know where it's going to be a little bit more often. They're not crunching the numbers and saying, hey, well, I'm plus 15 with this guy and plus 2 with that guy, so one of them's better. I think it's about how it feels. Is there truth to the idea that Scheifele has preference? I don't know. He's never said that to me. But if you listen to the way that he talks about Kyle Connor when prompted, and you listen to the way that he talks about Nikolaj Ehlers when prompted, one of them's a little bit more glowing. And so,
absolutely, there's no doubt about that.
It's one of those things that I can't say I know because he's never said it. Nobody's ever said it out loud. But I think it's a fair interpretation to make based on the sum of what we've seen over the years where, the decision's been clear. We know that Scheifele and Wheeler in particular, this has been reported by Eric Duhacek, at one point went to Paul Maurice during Kyle Connor's rookie season and said, give us the kid, give us Connor. And there was a decision kind of made collectively. Obviously, the coach has final say, but we know that there's some amount of influence available to players in these situations. And I think that Scheifele would be of the status that, they'd at least entertain that sort of thing. But again, I can't say I know it. I just think it's reasonable to talk about.
Yeah, I listen, I think it is the most fair interpretation of what we've heard from it. And listen, this sort of things happens. People do have preferences. I will say, though, it is a little puzzling, just from speaking about Scheifele, in that, we know what a hockey nerd he is. We know how driven he is to succeed. We know that, he wants to win, but he also wants to, be at the top of the scoring list and all that. And the evidence is there that it's actually more productive with Nikolaj Ehlers, and yet it's never seemed like that's been a first choice, at least to him, from what we can gather from everything that he's said when he's been asked pointed questions about this exact topic.
Yeah, and he'll tell you he's not the coach, he's not the GM, and he's not making those decisions, and that's completely fair. And at the same time, I've always interpreted that Mark Scheifele has some strong opinions about how hockey should be played, right? And there's been a couple of times where he said, he talks about that puck protection game on the perimeter, looking for the right time to move the puck into the middle. He had said that at times where Rick Bowness was talking about getting traffic in front and shooting from the point. There's been moments where you think, hey, maybe behind the scenes there's a little bit of disagreement on that front, and that's normal and that's okay, especially when you have a star caliber player like Mark Scheifele. Of course he's going to have strong opinions about how hockey should be played. He's awfully good at it, right? So I think that there's a lot of time for that. But if you listen to him talk about what he values in terms of playing style, it is that puck protection mode. It does involve holding onto pucks and beating players in one-on-one battles for space along the boards. And it does involve perfectly timed cuts into the middle of the ice. And when he and Kyle Connor are on their game, let's not pretend that they don't have offensive chemistry. They do connect well. It's the defensive side of the game where they give so much back. I think what feels like good hockey to Mark Scheifele is the kind of game that Kyle Connor plays. And that's good. Okay, fine. But Winnipeg is leaving and has left results on the table by deferring to that. And man, did I ever think that the three of them together looked like a great line in that 1/3 period of that one game in the playoffs when Bonus united them.
Yeah, me too. I was thinking the exact same thing. And bottom line is it hasn't happened. And, the revolving door on the second line with Ehlers, they tried it with Dubois for a long time. It wasn't in. Monahan's come in. There was some moments. Obviously, it didn't happen in the playoffs. And I think the playoff performance, and again, recency bias is real, whether you're a fan and certainly whether you're in management in the National Hockey League, probably not going, maybe not helping the cause to say we need to keep this guy. Which brings us to right now. There is, I don't say there's going to be massive turnover in this roster, but, both up front and on the blue line, there could be. The most significant player, certainly up front, on a potential move would be Nick. If the Winnipeg Jets trade him, and Kevin Cheveldayoff has been in this situation before, Dubois, Jacob Trouba, to name a couple, solid young players within 1 year of unrestricted free agency. In your opinion, Murat, what will the Jets be looking for in return before we get to some of the potential suitors?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a fun one to explore because the Jets have done well in this scenario. I'm not the guy standing here and saying this is a guarantee, it's a done deal. I can also tell you that previous trade talks with Nikolaj Ehlers' name involved have been more of a simmer, where sometimes the asking price on Winnipeg's behalf has become so ridiculous. And I think that's what happened in 2019 in discussions with the Carolina Hurricanes, where the ask has just become so big that it's clear that they actually don't have interest in moving him. Times have changed. 1 year away from that contract, we have seen Winnipeg do really well. You saw the Dubois trade. I think the Jakob Trouba trade is a good model, particularly if the receiving team has some faith in extending Ehlers once they have him, because Winnipeg got a first-round pick and a promising third-pairing defenseman in Neil Pionk at that time with some top-4 upside they believed he could step into, and at times he has. And I think that that's a sizable package for a player who's 1 year away from free agency. At the same time, my sense of things is that it might lean a little bit more heavy towards futures. Again, I don't know that. Again, I'm fairly convinced the Jets are focusing more on their head coaching search right now, and it won't be until sort of pre-draft times that things really pick up in earnest. But my guess is, and my belief is, I should say, more than a guess, I would say my belief is that draft capital will be the name of the day. They don't have a first-round pick via Sean Monahan. They don't have a third-round pick. I think that was from Tyler Toffoli. There have been some moves to take draft capital out. And if there's a little bit of futures-heavy trading involved in Nikolaj Ehlers, I wouldn't be surprised. The trick would be, how do they get value for him?
Well, and, like of all the teams that are listed as possibilities in your article, the one that is the most intriguing to me, if we're talking about futures, assets, picks, prospects, those sort of things, is Utah. We've talked for the last 3 years about how the Coyotes have continued to turn their roster over to trade for picks. They've got, seems like, about a dozen second and third rounders over the next couple. They hold their first rounders, and they've got a lot of young players that have been getting ready to kind of break in. What do you think of the fit with Utah? Because to be honest, I think a player like Ehlers going into a new market with that excitement would be an incredible fit for the, I can just keep calling them the Coyotes because they don't have a name right now, but for Utah, an exciting player that could come in, add some offense with the potential of keeping him longer term. And that maybe of any team right now, if we're talking picks in particular, has a surplus of them that I think would be of interest to Winnipeg.
Yeah, if you don't want to talk picks, we can get into the Jakob Chychrun conversation and how he's a similar player to Ehlers in that he might be more expendable to Ottawa than he would be in other places. And I think that's what Ehlers is facing here, which, I mean, I just see such quality in that player and in Chychrun too. In the case of Utah, though, that is a team, you'd have to see what I wrote or just check Cap Friendly or whichever source, but I counted it all up, and I think there were 10 second-round picks in the next 3 years and maybe 7 third-round picks.
Exactly.
In addition, they have all their first-round picks as well. This is an absolutely loaded team in terms of futures, and it's one that's so loaded that it could pay, that it could overpay for Ehlers. It could throw a first, a second, and a third and not sweat, not have to consider it as an overpayment because they have so many picks. You know that they have ambitious ownership. You know that, credit to the Coyote side of things, they've extracted all of these assets for so many different players and so many different contracts that they've absorbed over the years for other teams. You don't think that they're going to go to Utah and try to make a splash and try to make a competitive move? They've got some good young players. They've got top prospects that are blossoming. They have slightly older players like Lawson Krause came to mind for whatever reason, but Nick Schmaltz, for example, has been on fire. There have been a lot of different things. Clayton Keller has scored a ton of points. There are reasons to think that, I'm not sure that I see a playoff spot for them immediately, but I see some real strides made. And if they get ambitious and they go after a player like Ehlers, well, then you can just increase the expectations all the more.
I think Doug Armstrong would salivate at the prospect of having Ehlers playing with Clayton Keller with what he's able to do. And again, making that impact, like from an ownership standpoint, a dynamic, exciting player like Ehlers that brings fans out of their seats. I think would be a welcome addition to a team really trying to make an impact in their first year. But let's get back to Chychrun, because you sort of led off with him in it. And like, I totally see, like, I think the Winnipeg Jets, if they could swap out a forward for a real quality top four defenseman, I think they probably do that. I guess the question is, with the exception of the short term this season, for a team like Winnipeg, does that make sense to do, considering there's no certainty that Jakob Chychrun's staying past this year?
Yeah, I guess it really compares to what sorts of packages end up being on the table for them if, as I understand and assume, that this shopping becomes quite real. With Chychrun, it's almost as good of a fit, at least conceptually on paper, for us who get to speculate about things, as Pierre-Luc Dubois was for Patrick Laine back in the day, in that both players seemed to be discontent or malcontent in the places that they were. I think Laine absolutely loved Winnipeg, but just knew his future wasn't here, which would have been tough. And at that time, it seemed like, okay, well, what are the odds that another player, at least in the ballpark of quality, is available? And I think that there's some synergy there with Ehlers and Chychrun in that same way, where, with Thomas Chabot, with Jake Sanderson, with the future that Ottawa is building, there's a sense that their left side is covered. They may have tried him on the right and have mixed feelings about that. I think that he might see more opportunity in other places too, where instead of being part of a 3 defenseman rotation for power play minutes, there's more available. And we remember the incredible almost point per game seasons he had in Arizona, where they were leaning on him for everything. So there might be, an impetus on his part to get to free agency and choose his future. At the same time, I think on the ice, there's balance if Ehlers is set on free agency and if Chychrun is, or there's balance if both players are willing to resign. Otherwise, the balance kind of skews. And I don't know what the future holds for sure for either player, depending on where they are. But just in terms of Winnipeg, believe me, I think if the Jets had been able to snag a Chris Tanev-like player for their top four heading into the playoffs, things would have looked a little bit different against Colorado. See what he's done for Dallas. I think Chychrun isn't necessarily as much of a warrior as Tanev is, but would represent an upgrade at that second pair right side. And that's the type of player that I begin to covet if I'm looking at the Jets roster and thinking of the holes it has.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I do too, but I also think about next season and wonder whether it's Ehlers or whether it's Chychrun, if you're not able to extend the player, I mean, what happens in and around the trade deadline? This is a team that traditionally does not dive heavily into the free agent market and does everything they can to keep their assets. Now, to their credit, they've done a very good job at doing that. But with a new player coming into a new team 1 year away from free agency, I think you either need to blow the doors off with an offer, or there is a legitimate amount of risk. And that goes the same thing with keeping Ehlers for the season.
Yeah, both cases. And look, I mean, with a $6 million cap hit in Ehlers' case, it might mean, it sort of erodes at the sheer value of the deal, because some teams that might be interested in him would be cap strapped. And I could think of Pittsburgh as a good example of that. Or it might mean he returns to the Winnipeg Jets and becomes one of those situations of do they keep him or do they not, like Andrew Kopp was a couple deadlines ago. And Winnipeg certainly did well in that scenario. That was a great trade, and all the conditions bounced right. New York made it far. Everything landed just right. Brad Lambert fell to them. I mean, that's a lot of things going their way. But there might be some optimism from Winnipeg's part that, hey, we've gone through this. We're a patient organization. Shovel Dayoff has some success with moves exactly like that, where they're willing to take a risk like that. I continue to think plan A is draft capital and futures in advance of the Vegas draft. But I mean, they've got to be realistic about what the offers are like and pivot as necessary too.
Two other interesting teams that you mentioned in the article are the Buffalo Sabres, who are another team that's loaded with prospects and picks. But I wanted to ask you about the Hurricanes, especially considering the way they went out last night. I mean, a crazy natural hat trick for Chris Kreider in the third period. And Carolina's back to the drawing board. And that team in particular, Murat, has sort of 1 year before a huge chunk of some of the most important players on their team have the opportunity to hit the open market.
Yeah, what a story. I mean, they're a team that probably embraces the puck possession sort of mentality from top to bottom. It's an analytically informed decision. It's a coaching Rod Brindamore hard-nosed, hard forechecking type of decision. They've got a lot of good players who can contribute a little bit of offense and are just so hard on pucks. They win so many battles. The Carolina Hurricanes forecheck is one of the best things that any team does in the NHL, but they haven't had the goaltending. When goalies get hot, they get hurt. And certainly, even though they scored a lot of goals, I think they were in the top 10 this year. And especially Jake Gensel, I mean, what a fit he had been. They didn't get it done again in the playoffs. And there might be some impetus there to say, hey, well, we actually do need a little bit more finishing on this roster, especially from, somebody who contributes so much to puck possession, albeit in a different way, like Nikolaj Ehlers does. I know that they poked around in 2019. That's an awful long time ago now, but it does convey interest in the player. And there could be a lot of fit alongside those star players. They're also cap strapped.
Well, exactly. And, I mean, listen, the Jets could afford to bring players back. But I'm still, the more we talk this through and look at where, and I think Brad Lambert's a big part of it. The fact that he had the season that he had, I think, they might have the confidence that if Ehlers does move on and they, get futures or fortify the blue line, that they've got a talented young player that might be able to come in and not necessarily be a perfect replacement for Ehlers, but has the potential to grow into a difference maker. But when we're talking futures, Buffalo to me is really intriguing. And, certainly there's the argument to be made, get picks, draft well, develop them, and turn them into players. But I kind of think that where the Jets are right now, with Elias Salmonson and Lambert and Chychrun, and certainly Rutger McGroarty in the next year, that it might make more sense to have players that were already drafted. They've got the number one prospect pool in the league. And, you mentioned a player like Matt Savoy, who we all saw excel with the Winnipeg Ice. He went back to junior this year. He was a top 10 pick in the draft. Another player that, that might be expendable from Buffalo based on, Zach Benson and everything else that they have, that might be, a fit, but also intriguing based on the timelines of when the Winnipeg Jets look to sort of shift over this core to a whole whackload of new players that haven't yet played regularly in the NHL.
I think the Hockey News should publish a Meet the 2029 Stanley Cup Champions article with the Buffalo Sabres on the front, all of their quality. And I mean, look how far the Jets got when everybody peaked, right? They were a very, very good team for a while there. I think the Sabres are well built. I think that they've got a lot of young and veteran players that are stepping into their own, and there's reason to think that they have a lot of success on the way. Their prospect pool is also so deep that one imagines there are players who could shake loose from it more readily than in other markets. And that's where Savoy, who I think would be ludicrous for a lot of teams to trade, is maybe at the upper echelon of players that could move. I was talking to our guy, Matt Fairburn, out in Buffalo, though, and he says, okay, well, that is a player they like. Benson, they're incredibly high on. It's not only him. The Sabres have defensemen who are kind of in the upper tier of their prospect pool as well, who are a little bit closer to NHL already, some in college, some in Europe. There are teams like that, and I think Detroit would be another good example, where the prospect pool is rich, that it is a step ahead, just like you said, where they're a little bit more ready to be NHL ready. And I got to remind everybody that go back to that 2017-18 team. One of the reasons the team was great was, its leadership, like Blake Wheeler was at the height of his career in a lot of ways. Another reason it was great was because the Jets were absolutely loaded with young players who made a difference for very little cap hit. And if you're the Winnipeg Jets and you want to go a little bit beyond picks for, a late teens, early 20s player ready to make a difference, and you're willing to give those players ice time, like Wyatt Johnson, I think is a fun one to talk about right now. There's a lot to be gained from that in supplementing a group that obviously wants to win now and in the immediate.
Murat is with The Athletic. Go to theathletic.com. You can read the entire long read on all sorts of potential landing spots if the Winnipeg Jets decide to move Nikolaj Ehlers.